David Luke is coming. David Luke, her, and David. Yes. Okay. 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 A very good afternoon. Could we kindly take up our seats? I would like to make an announcement before we start. There is a gala dinner at 7 p.m., but that will depend on whether we start on time or not, because the cars could leave at any time. So the vehicles take off at exactly 6. Nothing like 6:30. So it would be nicer if we started a bit earlier this session. I would like to kindly ask everyone that is still standing to take up your seats. Voila, thank you. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, our attendees joining us from all around the world on our social media platforms. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and a very warm welcome once again. My name is Maggie Umutesi, and I'm the managing editor for Mansa Media, where we focus on market entry into Africa, but through storytelling. Now, I know we have a very limited time. We have limited time, probably an hour or less. So I'll just jump into the session. And without further ado, I would like to welcome you all to this session, a special event that is launching the Africa Sustainable Development Report for 2022. As we settle in, I'd like to play for you a video that gives more insight into the reports. Kindly take a look. Technical, could you please put it up?
Distinguished guests, it's my pleasure to be speaking with you today. I want to thank the African Development Bank, the Economic Commission for Africa, and the United Nations Development Programme for hosting this conference and for also having me here today. Energy is critical to everyday life and is an essential part of everything we do. Yet energy also accounts for 2/3 of global emission and contributes significantly to climate change. At Sustainable Energy for All, we are focused on achieving Sustainable Development Goal 7, universal access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy, which is currently not a reality for close to 600 million people on the African continent. While it is important that we accelerate progress on energy access, without which we will not achieve our net zero ambition, we must also do this in a manner that is clean and sustainable. And today, we have the opportunity to do this quickly and more effectively. I want to talk about 3 essential enablers that would allow us to be ambitious and optimistic for success. 1, we need data. Our plans, policies, and implementation must be backed by robust and dynamic data and an analysis. 2, collaboration is key. No country or government can achieve net zero on its own. We need partnerships across the global north and south, across the African continent, and even across public and private sector players in order to go faster together. And 3, massively scaled up, affordable finance is absolutely essential and probably the most essential. None of our plans will be possible without support, especially technical expertise, but also financing to make sure projects are implemented on ground. I am pleased that through this convening of like-minded organizations and individuals, we have a unique opportunity to bring together young Africans along with policymakers, climate experts, the private sector, and researchers to focus on regional and continental integration to accelerate Africa's clean energy transition and bring us to an inclusive and sustainable future for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, the launch of this report comes at a time when our world is experiencing unprecedented events. If we look at the devastation caused by extreme weather, that has displaced millions of people, affected our economies, and also damaged infrastructure. Later on, add on the coronavirus pandemic that also has stressed economies. And to add into that, we're looking at the war in Ukraine that has seen rising inflation, rising debt that has all distressed countries across Africa. Now, everything around us is changing. And in this very moment of disruption, there is an opportunity to reimagine ways on how to fast track the implementation of the SDGs. And I'm super excited to listen to the insights or recommendations in this report. But I think most importantly, this is a moment for us to rethink and also find ways on obviously how to implement SDGs. And we'll be hearing a lot from our experts. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ms. Ahuna Aziakona, the Assistant Administrator, Director, Regional Bureau for Africa, UNDP, to give her opening remarks.
Thank you, Maggie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be able to welcome all of you today to the launch of the 5th edition of the African Sustainable Development Report. And UNDP, in collaboration with the African Union Commission, the UNECA, and of course the Africa Development Bank, is mandated by the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development to track the performance of African countries in achieving the SDGs and also attaining the goals that are outlined in the Agenda 2063. In doing so, we aim to highlight emerging opportunities for policy intervention and for practical action across the continent. This year's report, ladies and gentlemen, comes at a period of heightened uncertainty, as we have been hearing since morning. It does highlight the implications of the triple shocks of COVID-19, climate change, and the war in Ukraine on sustainable development in Africa. Many African countries have used these crises, or they've turned this crisis into an opportunity in addressing poverty and inequality, in addressing or initiating energy transitions, in making plans to ensure food security, and in promoting the availability of decent work. Despite these efforts, a lot more needs to be done. Africa no longer needs to wait on the margins, and the time is now for the continent to rechart its development path and own its own development agenda. This year's African Sustainable Development Report brings some hope and optimism. Across the continent, African governments are renewing their commitment to leave no one behind by implementing new and innovative policies that were once seen as out of reach for these governments. The progress towards the SDGs has been slow, stagnating at around 53% in 2020 and 2021. Midway through the timelines that are set to achieve the SDGs, it is becoming clear that many of our countries in Africa will not be able to achieve their targets. This is why we must work together and forge meaningful partnerships that will deliver the change that Africa deserves. The recently concluded COP27 reminded us of the urgency and the importance of immediate action to trigger and finance green transitions across Africa, but to do so in ways that do not compromise Africa's development aspirations. Definitely, all of this will require building strategic partnerships that create the dynamic around our key development challenges. One lesson that we have learned from this pandemic is the importance of global solidarity, shared responsibility, and cooperation. We need to strengthen domestic resource mobilization, yes. We need to strive more to tap into new and innovative financial instruments. But above all, we need to buy into a new multilateralism that sees a global community that understands the importance of enlightened self-interest. Distinguished guests, as we move forward, we need to be bold, we need to be courageous. We must adopt ambitious policies and implement them wholeheartedly, not just on paper, but also in reality. Concerted efforts are required to ensure our decisions benefit current and future generations. And let me close by reiterating UNDP's unwavering support to accompany these countries in their recovery from external shocks and help them to get back on track in achieving the SDGs and Agenda 2063. We commit to work with sister agencies in the UN system, but also with development banks and other multilateral institutions that work in Africa to combine our efforts and our assets to get greater impact. The fifth African Sustainable Development Report provides a pathway for this level of collaboration and partnership. At UNDP, we are honored to partner with the African Union Commission, with the African Development Bank, and the UNECA on this very timely publication. And I want to call on all of you really to integrate the report's findings into your policy formulation processes and your advocacy agenda for promoting Africa's development. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ahuna. As mentioned, obviously, it was a collaboration between different institutions. And at this particular moment, I'd like to invite Dr. Hanan Mosi, the Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist at United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, to give us some opening remarks too.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you to the launch of the 2022 Africa Sustainable Development Report, which is taking place in the context of our deliberation on the theme of building back better from the corona disease while advancing full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This topic is really central to Africa's economic and social transformation, and at the core of our collective goal of eradicating poverty and achieving sustainable and inclusive development in Africa. On behalf of the Economic Commission for Africa, I would like to extend my deep appreciation to our partners, the African Union Commission, the African Development Bank, and UNDP for jointly preparing the report, and to African governments, civil society, academia, and private sector for the rich and substantive inputs in this process. In particular, the country case studies in the report provide invaluable insights on the progress made in the implementation of the SDGs and related goals of the Agenda 2063, as well as challenges faced. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2022 Africa Sustainable Development Report marks an important performance milestone and a stark reminder of the needed collective efforts to accelerate implementation. We all know that the decade for action for sustainable development goals has been challenged by natural and human-induced factors, such as climate change, COVID-19, and the war in Ukraine. In this context, documenting the potentially disruptive impacts of the crises is vital for experience sharing by member states on the respective strategies to regain traction on their global commitments and regional commitments. Focusing on the goals of the 2022 High-Level Political Forum, the report illustrates important trends in Africa's SDG and Agenda 2063 trajectory. First, the continent has made great strides in increasing completion rates, particularly at primary school level. Completion rates at this level increased from almost 60% in 2015 to 63% in 2020. Second, child marriages are on the decline. The proportion of women married before the age of 15 declined from 12.6% in 2015 to 10.8% in 2021. Similarly, political representation of women is on the rise. Third, there is growing awareness of the need to protect Africa's marine resources. Compared to the global average of 20%, African countries, excluding North Africa, protected 23% of their marine areas in 2021. Fourth, African countries are making good progress in the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of mountain ecosystems. The average proportion of protected mountain key biodiversity areas increased from 16% in 2000 to 27.6% in 2020. North Africa, and from 33% to almost 42% in the rest of Africa during the same period. Ladies and gentlemen, despite these positive trends, challenges do remain. In particular, inadequate school infrastructure and the lack of trained teachers, especially at secondary level, remain a concern in Africa, as it adversely affects the quality of education. Furthermore, regulations and enforcement of legal frameworks to protect women and girls against discrimination, domestic violence, child marriage, and female mutilation remain weak. In 2020, only 65.6% of legal frameworks in Africa, excluding North Africa, addressed violence against women, significantly lower than the global average of 78%. Despite increased awareness, coastal, marine, and freshwater ecosystems are affected by pollutants from human activities in most African countries. This is partly due to the lack of appropriate circular economy policies and regulations to protect marine and freshwater resources from waste and plastic pollution. Distinguished guests, Africa must pay closer attention to the looming threat of land degradation. This phenomena affects 46% of Africa's land and 65% of the population, and costs the region $9.3 billion annually. Replicating and scaling up homegrown initiatives, such as Ethiopia's Green Legacy Initiative, can enhance Africa's efforts to restore degraded land, conserve its forests, and promote sustainable development. In an era of depleted fiscal buffers and growing debt vulnerabilities, the continent has made little progress in the implementation of SDG 17, partnerships for the goals. Africa's domestic revenue generation continues to lag other regions. Meanwhile, OECD countries have collectively fallen short of their target to dedicate 0.7% of their gross national income to official development assistance. Debt management has been challenging for African countries, and rising debt servicing obligations are diverting scarce resources from much needed socioeconomic development priorities. The debt service burden increased from 27.9% of exports of goods and services in 2019 to 29.5% in 2021. Boosting domestic resource mobilization is therefore imperative. Digital technologies have proven to boost domestic resource mobilization and create jobs. Yet, even though access to the internet in Africa more than doubled from 16.3% per 100 inhabitants in 2015 to 35% per 100 inhabitants in 2021, more investments in this area are needed to fully benefit from digitalization. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude by highlighting the following key policy recommendations, which can catalyze and accelerate the implementation and achievement of SDG 4, 5, 14, 15, and 17, as well as the related goals of Agenda 2063. One, closing the education financial gap by mobilizing financial resources for schools infrastructure and improving the quality of teacher training. Strengthening legal frameworks that protect women and girls from violence and child marriage, and outlawing practices such as female genital mutilation. Creating awareness of waste management and infrastructure development in coastal areas to curb pollution. Scaling up efforts to domesticate and implement policy frameworks to foster sustainable management of forests, biodiversity, and land. Finally, scaling up investments in digital infrastructure to support the deployment of digital technologies for domestic resource mobilization and the delivery of social services. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm hopeful that the findings and recommendations of the 2022 Africa Sustainable Development Report will help member states across Africa to rebound from the crises and accelerate implementations of SDGs and related goals of Agenda 2063. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Hanan. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage. We'll be having a conversation and also presenting key findings in the reports. We have Mr. Craig Davids, a member of the Youth Alliance for Leadership and Development in Africa. Ms. Meseret Warner, the founder and managing director, Ignite Investments Addis Ababa. And Bartholomew Amar, Chief Development Planning Section, Macroeconomics and Governance Division, UNECA. Okay. Well, so now we kick off the session. And I would like to start with asking the technical team to please help us roll out the presentation. Bartholomew, I think you can take the stage to give us some key findings and recommendations from this particular report.
Yeah. Good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to share some of the key findings of this report, which is a joint report between the Economic Commission for Africa, the UN Development Program, UNDP, African Union Commission, and the African Development Bank. This has been a long-standing relationship that started during the era of the MGDs and has continued since then. So my job is to give the key highlights of the report, which focuses, as has been initially stated, on the 5 areas of the high-level political forum for 2022, which focused on education, gender, life underwater and life above water, and then on partnerships. We also make it a point to analyze the corresponding goals, targets, and indicators of Agenda 2063 in this report, data permitting. And we also took into account some of the socioeconomic impacts of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And our data is largely based on international data and facilitate inter-country comparisons. So what I'm going to do is to give just a quick view of what's happening, but looking at progress in terms of the areas where we're doing better, doing well, which is green, areas where we need to accelerate, which is yellow, and areas where there's been regression. So as we can see from the data, in terms of, and we're looking at the indicators of the SDGs. So one of the indicators relates to ODA, Official Development Assistance flows for scholarships by sector and type of study. And this is an area where, given the data that we have, there's evidence that Africa receives most of this official development assistance. But when we look at areas where we need to improve, one is the critical area of proficiency in reading and mathematics. That is an area of stagnation. Secondly, preschool education, participation in preschool education has stagnated, as has the quality of teacher training. So access to teacher training is a problematic area. Now, while completion rates have increased up until 2020, there's evidence to suggest that there's going to be a reversal. COVID has impacted adversely on completion rates, and about 69 million kids were out of school in 2021. With respect to the goal on gender, areas that we can be proud of are the decline in female genital mutilation and the share of women in national parliaments, which increased to about 25% from about 11.5% for sub-Saharan Africa. But areas that we need to work on are child marriages. Children below 15 and 18 years respectively declined, but only marginally, 2 percentage points between 2015 and 2020. The percentage of women in managerial positions has increased, but it's also marginal, 1 percentage point. And as was highlighted in the previous opening speeches, laws and regulations around women's empowerment, and including the area of safeguards for abortion, have also pretty much stagnated, and we need to work more in those areas. Now, with respect to life underwater, marine resources are a potential source of wealth, but we're having challenges as well as some areas of improvement. The area of improvement relates to laws that are protecting these marine areas from degradation. However, In terms of implementation of international instruments to combat illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing, there has been no change. And this is a critical area. I mean, access to fish, most island states depend on fishing for their economic survival. And to the extent that we allow that, we are not successful in combating unregulated fishing, it's going to affect economic growth going forward. Beach litter is a big factor in Africa. Globally, it has declined, but for Africa, it increased marginally from 76% to 77% of our beaches being experiencing litter. And there's also a decline in fish resources as a percent of GDP. This is also consistent with the lack of strong laws to combat illegal fishing. With respect to life on land, the positive story is that we are protecting our mountain cover. I mean, our mountains, in terms of the diversity of resources on those mountains, we're doing a good job in terms of protecting our mountain resources, including through participating in adopting frameworks that facilitate this protection. And in terms of ODA, official development expenditure on conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in ecosystems, resources are flowing at an increasing level to this area, rising from 345 million in 2000 to 2.77 billion in 2018. However, we are in the area of above ground biomass stock. Basically, this means vegetation, live and dead vegetation, which is a source of a carbon sink for Africa. That kind of biomass is declining over time. So our natural capital, if you will, in this respect is declining. Forest area as a proportion of total land area is also declining due to climate change, and also due to the fact that individuals are using it for grazing and also as livelihoods. Because as the economic situations get more difficult, it becomes more difficult to prevent individuals from using the natural habitats for economic survival. And our natural habitats and our species are also under threat of extinction. Now, these are also sources of economic development, sources of economic wealth, and as they go down in terms of the numbers of these species, it has implications for development going forward. Now, with respect to partnerships, we all know that COVID has had a big impact on our fiscal positions, and this has been reflected in our rising debt service costs. And about 18 countries, African countries, were at high risk of debt going into debt or debt vulnerability. So that's on the areas of retrogression. Funding for countries in the area of financing environmentally sound technologies has also declined from about 8.7 billion in 2015 to 6.5 billion, or 6.05 billion. Now, as countries seek to move in the area of renewable energy, the need for technologies becomes important. But if this indicator is going down, then it means that the ability for African countries to actually move into renewable energies is going to be a challenge going forward. And an area of concern here, a third area, is the average tariffs that African countries experience when they export their commodities. These tariff rates have gone up as opposed to going down globally. So for Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, it rose from 6.7%, that is the average tariff, to 7.5% between 2018 and 2020. And for the global average was 3.9%. Now, what this means is that given the fact that Africa now is embarking on an African free trade area, which provides opportunities for tariff-free or low-tariff intra-Africa trade, this could perhaps be an unwitting opportunity for us to really focus more on that area of trade. On the positive side, the proportion of the domestic budgets funded by domestic taxes in Africa is higher than the global average. But we need to watch this indicator as countries get into debt more and more into debt, we wonder whether this will be sustained over time. And the proportion of individuals using the internet has improved, as has ODA. On the other hand, however, the total government revenue as a proportion of GDP is going down or has stagnated around 16%, which means that the ability of countries to actually finance their own development is under threat, which calls for higher domestic resource mobilization and more efforts to stem the tide of illicit financial flows. And then finally, FDI and ODA and South-South cooperation as a proportion to the domestic debt is stayed stagnant, and our access to fixed broadband internet subscriptions has also stagnated, meaning that the ability to really use digital technologies is constrained by the lack of this infrastructure. Now, let me conclude by highlighting a few of the policy recommendations, not all of them. The first in the area of education is the need to really strengthen our ICT infrastructure so as to enable countries to be able to absorb these shocks such as COVID that makes education, physical in-person education a difficulty. Revitalizing the teaching profession and ensuring the quality of teaching is increased is critical to enhancing our human capital. And our social protection programs, as we saw in COVID, as individuals got pushed into poverty, the lack of social protection programs was a critical lapse in our policy orientation. And in the area of gender, it has been highlighted the need to really protect women and girls from violence, child marriage, and outlaw practices such as female genital mutilation. With respect to life underwater, it is clear that we need to create awareness of waste management and infrastructure, and in the development, infrastructure development in coastal areas to curb pollution, and really to harness our marine resources and to see them as a resource and not simply as just water. But life on land, with respect to life on land, the declining forest cover is a major concern because we know that forest cover is a source of carbon sinks. And if we can actually leverage that as a resource in terms of monetizing it, it will be critical. We talked this morning about the need for the polluters to pay, but we didn't talk about the need for those countries that are net carbon sinks, that provide a public resource in the form of really absorbing all this carbon from the atmosphere. They are not being paid for providing that service. And so I think it's something that we need to think about. In the area of partnerships, we need to expand fiscal space through domestic resource mobilization and then eliminate this tendency of providing tax incentives that do not really generate the necessary rewards in terms of cost benefit, address illicit financial flows, and also strengthen debt management policies, systems, and ensure that there's more transparency in our debt negotiations. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussions going forward.
Thank you, Bartholomew. I know you've given us some policy recommendations, and but I want to put you on the spot again to move away from the recommendations you've shared with us and practically look at some areas we could focus on. Looking at the reports, it's very unlikely that Africa will achieve the SDGs, right? Besides the recommendations you've shared with us, do you think there are some areas that require attention to fast track, the implementation of these SDGs?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a difficult question, but comes up all the time. I think the policy recommendations are not the difficult part. It is the implementation strategies. I think we've not paid enough attention to implementation strategies. And why do I say that? We know, for example, that value addition is key to job creation. But when we propose policies like value addition, I think we need to ask the question, who benefits and who loses when you begin to add value or when you say, for example, you're going to produce rice internally as opposed to importing it, right? So the political economy of policy implementation is critical. So to answer your question, I think we need to focus on value addition, leveraging our agricultural raw materials. A lot has been said about our minerals that are necessary ingredients for green products like electric batteries. But there are winners and there are losers. And some of these losers are very powerful entities and individuals. And therefore, what we need to ask is how do we make sure that we align their interests with the new direction, right? So if an individual is importing rice and making a lot of money out of that, and you're asking that person to now be part of a movement to produce local rice, what incentives are you giving those individuals who are powerful, who can actually stop this process from being part of the new movement? And I think that's where our new thinking should be about, looking at the political economy of implementing some of these very well-known and sensible policies, but we ask after 20 years or so, why is it that they're not being implemented? And I think it's really taking into account the personal interests and aligning it with the social and collective interests.
And just to build on that, I think a lot of times you hear, for example, building all this infrastructure, but that infrastructure will require financing, will require investments to be able to set some of these policies, as you mentioned. And I want to bring you in to Meseret to look at how we can attract financing, but not just financing, innovative ways of financing that could obviously help us achieve the SDGs while also thinking about inclusivity.
Great. Getting into late afternoon, I feel like we are standing between people running into dinner and stuff, so I'll be quick. Two of the takeaways I took from this morning is one, getting the private sector engaged so that we can move away from the academic exercise that we all see. The other one is also the amazing expression of this morning is the bold, homegrown, innovative solutions. So being in the tech and investment ecosystem that I am for the last few years, is that the young Africans are actually already solving some of these problems, but getting access to finance. So what I would be remiss, and it's self-serving, that one of the things that we do is equity crowdfunding platform that's new for Ethiopia, even for Africa, where we are focusing on the $80 billion the Africans are remitting into the continent every single year. Granted, most of that money is gonna go to supporting family, right? Education, healthcare, things like that. But there is also a lot of resource that's not going into the productive sector of the economy where it would be able to finance SMEs, startups that are solving amazing, amazing challenges. If we look at, for example, Twiga Foods out of Kenya, where they are actually connecting producers with retailers that's solving the inefficiencies, the post-harvest loss. Some of the statistics for me, being a tech person, is that the Kenyans that are using Twiga Foods, they improved from 30% post-harvest loss to 3%. That is supporting the millions of Africans that depend on agriculture, but also giving access to finance for smallholder farmers, but also creating job opportunities for the millions of Africans that we need and join the workforce every single year. So I do feel like there is finance, but it's not going in the right places. And just to take away the high-level discussion that we have had this whole day and take it in small, chewable sizes, is that how do we collaborate so that we direct this finance into this? For example, the de-risking that we talked about this morning. if we do collaborate, and I hear, for example, in Ethiopia, UNDP is coming up with solution, innovative finance. So how do we work together so that we make these challenging investment opportunities into attractive opportunities? One thing I will say, and I will pass the mic, is that money will go where the profit is. How do we make it attractive, profitable opportunity so that the money actually comes to us instead of we chasing it? That's how I look at it.
Thank you. I want to bring you back, but I'll go to Cole Davis. I wanted you to answer for me the question that she raised, because it makes sense if we just crash it here and then. But I know we are the people standing between the dinner and the audience, so we're going to have to move a bit faster. And next to you, obviously, is Cole Davis, who is working tirelessly in the entrepreneurship space, SMEs. And as you were speaking, obviously, I just thought, it would be nice to bring him in to give us the perspective how entrepreneurship and youth can actually be a catalyst to attaining SDGs.
Yeah, I believe that I would love to agree with Ms. Ahuna when she said practical action is now needed. I think there's firstly this huge imbalance between people, systems, and our programs that we deploy. You ask, where do we start that implementation? I think we need to find that balance between the people factor, the systems factor, and the programs. As I'm sitting over here, I believe that we ran a program last year out of South Africa who was struggling so much with load shedding, and we were forced to become innovative. But my question is Africa always going to wait for a crisis before we look for solutions? I look at this room over here, and I'm looking for more young people in the room, and I'm questioning even that. And I'm saying, what you know you can act on, but it's what you don't know that acts on you. And I believe we know the stats, we know the challenges, but what are we going to do practically? And we implemented a mentorship program just for young entrepreneurs that can be deployed in about 10 or 14 different African countries, that reached so much, create so many jobs and hope, that I believe that brought that light up again and says, there's so much more I can do with this. I would also want to say that I believe that we saw in some of the stats that there was about 69 million of youth that is out of school. I believe now it's a good time for partnership. We did a partnership with Microsoft where we helped more than 10,000 young people with the Global Skills Initiative while I was sitting in South Africa with load shedding with only 40 entrepreneurs in a call center. So I believe practical solutions like this needs to happen now. It's not waiting for another conference or another report. We know the stats. I believe entrepreneurs should step up now, come up with solutions. And I believe Africans, we are entrepreneurially by nature, but I think we struggle to find solutions when we look at our challenges that we face. So I think that is important at the moment.
I want to bring you in, Bathroom. Can you just, for me personally, Bartholomew? I mean, when he talks about entrepreneurship and having to create opportunities for youth across Africa, we have to also acknowledge that steps have been taken, especially towards creating the AFCFTA and enabling, for example, cross-border trades and cross-border partnerships, which has actually been launched and ratified. But my question is, do you actually believe it has the capacity to scale this up?
Yes, I believe, I believe that a large component of our populations are really off the radar screens of our governments. Why do I say that? I look at my own country, right? We have an informal sector where individuals are building vehicles. They're actually innovating, but the data doesn't even, we're not even leveraging that. And so what I say is that we should talk less about lack of capacity and more about how do we leverage the capacities that we actually have, because it does exist. And the young people, most of you have seen all these YouTube videos of kids building vehicles, building all kinds of things. Now, what if we're able to harness that and support these individuals? These are the potential affords of Africa, right? How do we support them in a way that is more structured? And at the same time, how do we create more Dangotes, for example, right? So really, I think our solutions are inward, but I think that we bought into this idea that we don't have capacity. We're always looking for capacity outside. But you see, capacity has to be appropriate to your situation. And the individuals that are struggling to make a living are making a living using what they have in their own environment. And that is capacity, but we're discounting it and looking for technology transfer. But when it's transferred, it doesn't apply because it's really not rooted in your systems. So I think we really need to rethink this whole idea of capacity.
So the question is about how to support the already existing entrepreneurs across the continent. And I want to bring you in, Meseret, because you are a businesswoman. You're into the investment space. I mean, a lot of times when we speak, we forget that the private sector has to be at the forefront of Africa's development. There is obviously need for public-private sector partnerships, but also that goes beyond just financing and looking at SDGs broadly. What role does the private sector play in this context?
Absolutely. I don't think one party can solve most of the challenges that we heard, but I think we also need to look at these challenges actually are investment opportunities. They are business opportunities. Some of, I'm not trying to throw myself into these young Africans, but I meet them every single day. And it is just the amazing solutions that they have. And from what we heard from the report, and also the whole morning, is how do we actually collaborate, not duplicate effort, and that we do not have efficient outcomes. So we look at many businesses, including women. For example, in Ethiopia, that I just met before I came here, young women who's doing solar energy distribution in the countryside in Ethiopia, off-grid population, which is 40% of Ethiopians are off-grid. She's also bringing pay-as-you-go solution, technology solution, so that it's affordable, accessible to a lot of smallholder farmers who are actually living way far from, access to energy. But she is already struggling because she did not have that partnership. And one of the things we discussed is ICT in Africa, in Ethiopia, is making amazing progress, and where she is trying to make partnership with the Ethio Telecom that has branches throughout the country, where she could use their resources to distribute her solar energy, and also partner with us, some of the diaspora investors who can actually give her working capital. As I mentioned earlier, UNDP is coming up with innovative finance lab. If we do that, she not only can actually scale up her solution and provide access to energy for millions of Ethiopians, but also create job opportunities, but also have a lot of potential for economic growth. But I just see it every day that we do come up with solutions that are completely fragmented. So how do we actually, I'm gonna get in trouble in Ethiopia, where private sector is really young and they look at private sector actually in suspicion instead of as solution providers. So, I'm glad I'm here, but where is the follow-up? I have been in many conferences already, and when I try to follow up and try to see how the SDG 17 that was outlined, Partnership for Solutions, and it's always the follow-up and the outcomes and the government policies that we have. how do we, it's not only government that's actually looking at the private sector in suspicion, but also the private sector, that we look into government as solution providers. Government is just enabler. It's not really a place for a solution for everything. So to me is, how do we actually use the resources that we have, including the many local capitals that are sitting, and use them to go into the productive sector of the economy. And that can only happen if the private sector is actually looked at as a partner, not looking into that they're only profit seekers. That should be looked at as a positive, because they're going for profit, which means they have to solve it in order to make money, and not in suspicion and not excluding them. I hope that, so, convoluted answer is somewhere.
Just to reiterate it. So there is willingness from the private sector, but then it has to be looked at as a player, not just, okay. I want to bring in David, because we had a chat earlier on, and you said to me that, all conversations that have happened in the morning, you have a feeling that they should have touched on leadership a little bit further, because it plays an important role in achieving these SDGs. What did you mean by that?
Well, when I look at the SDGs, I believe that there's one encompassing common denominator, and that is leadership. South Africa is struggling with a lot of things, but I think one of the major things we are struggling with is ethical leadership. And but three things that I believe needs to happen is, number one is we need to start building lasting relationships. Number two, we need to start doing regular stock taking. Number three, before we even enter into a space like this, we need to have the exit program for this before we even enter India. Because with ethical leadership right now, there is so much needed. I look at my own country and I say, it's not just another leader that I need in Africa, it's an ethical leader that I need to help us guide around all of these issues that we have, but to become the solution, to become that person, to become that solution that we can look at. And when I say your network should then become your net worth. And so sometimes we look outside for the problem when the problem is within your network in your surrounding areas. And I believe that is crucial for me, that needs to be unpacked, understood, and definitely better explained going forward.
Thank you. I've been told we are running out of time, but I'm going to ask for 2 minutes to close this up. Bartholomew, thank you so much. Cole Davis, thanks a lot. And Ms. Sarit, thanks for joining us. But as we close up, in 30 seconds, I don't know what you can say in 30 seconds. How do we get Africa back on track in your perspective? 30 seconds.
Well, I think we need to feel the urgency, and sometimes shocks like these crises are critical. I mean, we've heard that, for example, Ethiopia's producing wheat, Zimbabwe produced more wheat than it needed in its own economies. I think what it really takes is some pressure from below, right? I don't think there's anything new that we know. We know the answers, it's execution. But what triggers that execution is some kind of sense of existential threat in some cases. And so I really think that we need to put pressure on our leaders to do the right thing, and also to hold their feet to the fire.
He just say put their feet on the fire, but also I think I'm going to challenge development partners to put their feet on the fire. And I think the academic exercise need to move into action. I think there are huge opportunities for a lot of partnership. If there's one thing I could leave here, it would be ecosystem building for government to be creating enabling environment, development partners like you. I saw today amazing research data that helps the private sector, for example, with intelligent data-driven decision-making and investment from the private sector to enable these challenges to be turned into business opportunities and where we can actually work together and have a solution. And to me, that's ecosystem building by building on what everybody else is doing, not really duplicating effort and wasting resources might be a way to go.
Well, I would love to believe that we need to start owning our own development and not be seen as an add-on or as an auxiliary. When you say put the feet in the fire, I would love to say let's add to the fire so the feet can stay warm and we can understand that this is a consistency, this is a program, this is a long run, this is not something that's just for an event and for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to add on my panelists, let's give them a round of applause, please. Just to add on that as I close up this session, I think there is urgent need for private sector intervention. And like she's mentioned, there is willingness by looking around to see how we can engage the private sector in Africa in in the implementation of the SDGs and development of some of the projects would be very ideal, but also looking at innovative financing. I can't stress this enough because it's a conversation we've had since morning, climate financing and looking for innovative ways to bring in the money. We can't rely only on aid. I mean, I don't know the link between aid and growth, but I haven't seen great numbers there. Are they? Not really. But also leveraging on the resources we already have. We already have a big population, a lot of young entrepreneurs, SMEs that are really trying to solve some of our biggest problems within our society. So just to close the session, thanks a lot for joining us, and to our panelists, thank you so much for making the time. We wish you all a great evening at the gala dinner. Just an announcement. The vehicles will be leaving at 6. They're already outside, I've been told. So we don't have as much time to change, yeah? And the dinner is at 7 p.m. Enjoy the dinner, and thank you so much. Miss Meseret Warner, thank you. Cole David, thank you. And Bartholomew Ama, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Now that I know you are going to come visit. Recording stopped.